Welcome to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight, we journey into the mists of ancient Mesopotamia to a time before recorded history, when the gods walked among mortals and shaped the very essence of humanity. Let your mind drift as we explore the fascinating tale of the Anunnaki and their role in the creation of the first humans. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to be transported to a world of ancient mysteries and forgotten legends. In the beginning, there was only the vast cosmic ocean, the primordial waters that stretched infinitely in all directions. From these waters emerged the first gods, beings of immense power and wisdom. Among them were Anu, the supreme sky god, and Kai, the goddess of earth. Their union brought forth a new generation of deities, beings who would come to be known as the Anunnaki, the offspring of heaven and earth. The word Anunnaki itself carries profound meaning in the ancient Sumerian language. It can be translated as those who from heaven came to earth, or princely offspring. These were not mere spirits or abstract forces of nature, but powerful beings with agency, emotion, and purpose. They were said to number in the hundreds, perhaps even more, each with their own domains of influence and responsibility. The Anunnaki were led by a council of great gods. At the head of this council sat Anu, whose name meant heaven or sky. He was the father of the gods, the source of all divine authority. Though he ruled from the celestial realm, his influence permeated all levels of existence. Beneath Anu in the divine hierarchy were his sons, each commanding their own sphere of influence. Enlil, whose name meant Lord Wind or Lord Storm, was perhaps the most powerful of Anu's children. He was the god of air, wind, and storms, the force that separated heaven from earth. Enlil's authority extended over the terrestrial realm, and he served as the chief executive of the Divine Council. His word was law among gods and mortals alike. His temple in the city of Nippur was considered the centre of the world, the axis around which all creation revolved. Enki, also known as Ea, was Enlil's brother, and in many ways his complement. Where Enlil represented power and authority, Enki embodied wisdom and ingenuity. He was the god of water, knowledge, crafts, and creation. His domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the ancients believed lay beneath the earth. Enki was known as a friend to humanity, a clever god who often worked to help mortals, even when it meant defying the decisions of the Divine Council. These gods and their divine brethren lived in a world not unlike our own, filled with labour, conflict, and the need for order. According to the ancient texts, the younger gods, the lesser Anunnaki, were tasked with maintaining the world. They dug canals and rivers, tended the fields, and performed the countless labours necessary to sustain the cosmic order. For eons they toiled without complaint, but as the ages passed, their resentment grew. Imagine, if you will, divine beings of immense power, yet bound to endless back-breaking work. They carried baskets of earth, dug irrigation channels with their bare hands, and laboured under the scorching Mesopotamian sun. The lesser gods groaned under their burdens, their divine essence diminished by the ceaseless toil. Their dissatisfaction simmered like water slowly heating over a flame, until one day it reached a boiling point. The rebellion of the Anunnaki is one of the most compelling episodes in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. According to the epic poem known as the Atrahasis, the younger gods finally cast down their tools and refused to work any longer. They gathered in protest, surrounding the house of Enlil himself, their chants and cries echoing through the night. The great god awoke to find his palace besieged by the very beings who had once served him without question. Enlil was enraged by this insubordination. He called an emergency council of the great gods to determine how to deal with this unprecedented crisis. Should the rebels be punished? Destroyed? Or was there another solution? The council deliberated, and it was Enki, the wise and compassionate god, who proposed an alternative that would change the course of existence forever. Let us create a worker, Enki suggested, a being to bear the yoke of labour that the gods find so burdensome. We shall create humanity. The other gods agreed to this plan, seeing in it an elegant solution to their dilemma. But creating life was no simple matter. It required the right materials, the right knowledge, and the right divine power. Enki, with his vast wisdom and understanding of the mysteries of creation, took the lead in this monumental task. According to the ancient texts, the gods decided that to create humanity, they would need to sacrifice one of their own. A god named Wiela, also called Geshtu-i, was chosen for this purpose. The texts describe him as a god who possessed intelligence, or understanding. He was slain in a sacred ritual, and from his blood and clay taken from the earth, the first humans were fashioned. Picture this scene. The great gods assembled in a sacred chamber, the air thick with incense and anticipation. Enki directed the proceedings with precision and care. The blood of the slain god was mixed with clay, the two substances combining to form a paste that contained both the material of the earth and the divine essence of the gods themselves. This mixture was then divided and shaped. The goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami, the mother goddess, played a crucial role in this act of creation. She was the divine midwife, the shaper of life. With her skilled hands, she moulded the clay and blood into forms, creating 7 males and 7 females. These were the first humans, beings that combined the earthly and the divine, the mortal and the immortal. The creation of humanity was not a single event, but a process, refined over time. The earliest humans were prototypes, experiments in divine craftsmanship. Some ancient texts describe failed attempts, beings created with defects or imperfections. But eventually the gods perfected their technique, and humanity as we know it came into being. These first humans were imbued with a divine spark, the essence of the god whose blood had been used in their creation. This gave them intelligence, consciousness, and the ability to understand and carry out the wishes of their creators. But they were also tied to the earth, mortal and finite, unlike the gods who had made them. They were designed to serve, to labour in the fields and canals, to perform the work that the gods no longer wished to do themselves. At first, this arrangement seemed perfect. Humanity multiplied and spread across the land, building cities, cultivating crops, and maintaining the irrigation systems that were the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization. They built temples to honour their divine creators, offering sacrifices and prayers to ensure the gods' continued favour. The Anunnaki, freed from their labours, could devote themselves to higher pursuits, to governance, wisdom, and the maintenance of cosmic order. But as time passed, problems began to emerge. Humanity, created from divine blood, possessed intelligence and will of their own. They were not mere automatons, but thinking, feeling beings capable of choice and judgment. And like all intelligent beings, they were capable of both greatness and folly. The human population grew rapidly, spreading across the land of Sumer and beyond. Cities rose from the plains, each with its own king and patron deity. The noise of human activity began to disturb the gods, particularly Enlil, who found the constant clamour of humanity unbearable. The ancient texts describe how the noise of humanity kept Enlil awake at night, preventing him from finding rest. This may seem like a trivial complaint, but in the symbolic language of myth, it represents something deeper. The noise of humanity can be understood as disorder, chaos, the unpredictability of mortal life. As humans multiplied and their societies grew more complex, they became more difficult to control. They fought wars, committed crimes, and neglected their duties to the gods. They were no longer the obedient servants the Anunnaki had envisioned. Enlil's frustration with humanity grew until he decided that drastic action was necessary. He proposed to the Council of Gods that humanity should be reduced in number or even eliminated entirely. Several times he sent plagues and famines to thin the human population, but each time Enki intervened to help humanity survive. Enki, who had played such a crucial role in creating humans, felt a special connection to them and worked to ensure their continuation. The tension between Enlil and Enki over the fate of humanity came to a head in one of the most famous episodes of Mesopotamian mythology, the story of the Great Flood. This tale, which has parallels in many cultures around the world, tells of a divine decision to wipe out humanity entirely and start anew. According to the Atrahasis epic and later versions of the story, Enlil convinced the Divine Council that humanity had become too numerous and too troublesome. They decided to send a great flood that would cover the earth and destroy all human life. The gods swore an oath to keep this plan secret from humanity, ensuring that mortals would have no warning of the coming catastrophe. But Enki, ever the friend of humanity, could not stand by and watch his creations be destroyed. He found a way to circumvent the oath without technically breaking it. He spoke to the wall of the house of a wise and righteous man named Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Speaking to the wall rather than directly to the man, Enki revealed the god's plan and instructed Atrahasis to build a great boat and fill it with the seed of all living things. Atrahasis followed these instructions carefully, constructing a vessel of enormous size and bringing aboard his family, craftsmen, and representatives of every species of animal. When the flood came, it was more terrible than anything the world had ever seen. The heavens opened, and rain poured down for 7 days and 7 nights. The rivers overflowed their banks, and the sea rose up to swallow the land. Even the gods were frightened by the destruction they had unleashed, cowering like dogs in the highest reaches of heaven. As the waters rose, all life on earth perished, save for those aboard Atrahasis' boat. The ancient texts describe the scene with haunting beauty: the silence after the storm, the vast expanse of water with no land in sight, the floating corpses of gods and humans alike. The surviving gods looked down upon the destruction they had caused and felt regret. They had not anticipated the complete annihilation that would result from their actions. When the flood finally subsided and Atrahasis' boat came to rest on a mountain peak, he emerged and immediately offered sacrifice to the gods. The starving deities, who had been deprived of human offerings during the flood, smelled the sweet savour of the sacrifice and gathered around it like flies. They realised then how much they had come to depend on humanity, not just for labour, but for worship and sustenance through offerings. Enlil was initially furious when he discovered that humans had survived, but Enki defended his actions eloquently. He argued that destroying all of humanity was too extreme a solution. Instead, he proposed measures to keep the human population in check without resorting to total annihilation. Natural death, infertility in some women, infant mortality and other hardships would prevent humanity from growing too numerous again. The gods agreed to this compromise, and humanity was allowed to continue, though in a diminished and more controlled state. This story of creation and near destruction reveals much about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the divine. Humans were seen as servants of the gods, created to fulfill a specific purpose, yet they were also seen as possessing dignity and worth, beings that even the gods could not easily do without. The relationship between gods and mortals was complex, characterized by both dependence and tension, affection and frustration. The Anunnaki were not distant, abstract deities, but beings intimately involved in the affairs of humanity. They had human-like emotions and motivations. They could be jealous, angry, compassionate, and forgiving. They made mistakes, and occasionally regretted their decisions. This made them relatable to the people who worshipped them, gods who understood the struggles of existence because they experienced similar struggles themselves, albeit on a cosmic scale. The physical creation of humanity from clay and divine blood is a powerful metaphor that resonated deeply in ancient Mesopotamian culture. Clay was the most fundamental building material in their society. From clay, they made bricks for their houses and temples, tablets for writing, and vessels for storing food and water. To say that humanity was made from clay was to emphasize both our connection to the earth and our ability to be shaped and moulded by higher powers. The divine blood mixed into that clay-elevated humanity above mere animals. It gave humans the capacity for reason, for language, for art and culture. It explained why humans alone among earthly creatures could communicate with the gods, build civilizations, and contemplate their own existence. The divine spark within each person was both a gift and a burden, bestowing consciousness, but also the knowledge of mortality. Different ancient texts provide variations on the creation story, each adding unique details and perspectives. In one version, found in the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, the god Marduk creates humanity from the blood of the rebel god Kingu, who had led an army against the younger gods. This version emphasizes humanity's connection to chaos and rebellion, suggesting that humans inherit both the divine nature and the rebellious spirit of their divine progenitor. The Enuma Elish itself is a later text than the Atrahasis epic, composed around the 12th century BCE, during the rise of Babylon as a major power. It reflects Babylonian theology, which elevated Marduk to the position of supreme god, above even Anu and Enlil. In this text, Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat, who represents the chaotic saltwater ocean, and from her body creates the world. He then creates humanity to serve the gods, specifically to maintain the temples and provide offerings. These variations in the creation story reflect the evolving religious and political landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. As different cities rose to prominence, their patron deities were elevated in the divine hierarchy, and myths were adapted to reflect these changes. Yet beneath these variations, certain core themes remained constant: humanity's divine origin, our purpose as servants of the gods, and the complex, often ambivalent relationship between mortals and immortals. The cities of ancient Sumer each had their own patron deity, one of the Anunnaki, who was believed to dwell in the city's main temple. Enlil's city was Nippur, Enki's was Eridu, and the goddess Inanna, daughter of Anu, was the patron of Uruk. These gods were not simply worshipped from afar, they were considered the actual owners of their cities. The king ruled as the god's earthly representative, managing the deity's estate and ensuring that the temple was properly maintained and supplied with offerings. This theocratic system shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian society. The temple was not just a place of worship, but the economic and administrative centre of the city. Temple complexes controlled vast tracts of agricultural land, employed large numbers of workers, and engaged in trade and manufacturing. The wealth generated by these activities was used to support the priesthood, maintain the temple buildings, and provide for the elaborate rituals that honoured the gods. These rituals were considered essential to maintaining cosmic order. The gods required regular offerings of food, drink, and incense. They needed to be clothed, bathed, and entertained with music and dance. Special festivals marked the turning of the seasons, the agricultural cycle, and important events in the divine mythology. The most important of these was the New Year festival, which reenacted the creation of the world and ritually renewed the king's mandate to rule. The relationship between humans and the Anunnaki was essentially contractual. Humans provided service and worship. In return, the gods provided protection, fertility, and prosperity. When things went well, it was because the gods were pleased. When disaster struck, whether in the form of flood, drought, or military defeat, it was interpreted as divine displeasure, a sign that humans had failed in their duties or offended the gods in some way. This worldview gave the ancient Mesopotamians a framework for understanding their place in the universe. They were not random accidents of nature, but purposeful creations, beings designed by divine intelligence for a specific role. Their lives had meaning and significance, even if that meaning was defined primarily in terms of service to higher powers. This was not necessarily seen as demeaning. Serving the gods was considered an honour, a way of participating in the grand cosmic order. The wisdom of Enki, in particular, was celebrated in numerous myths and hymns. As the god of wisdom, magic, and crafts, Enki was credited with teaching humanity the skills necessary for civilization. He showed humans how to build houses, cultivate grain, domesticate animals, and work metal. He gave them writing, mathematics, and the arts. In essence, everything that separated civilized humans from barbarous humans was considered a gift from Enki. One of the most charming myths about Enki describes how he organized the world after its creation, assigning each natural phenomenon and cultural practice to its appropriate deity. He appointed gods to oversee the rivers and canals, the rain and the grain, the bricks and the ploughs. He established the proper functions of each craft and profession, ensuring that civilization would run smoothly. This myth reflects the Mesopotamian love of order and organization, their belief that the universe operated according to divinely established rules and procedures. Yet Enki was also known as a trickster figure, a god who could be cunning and even subversive when necessary. His willingness to defy the divine council to save humanity from the flood is the most dramatic example of this trait. But there are many other stories in which Enki uses his cleverness to solve problems or help those in need. This made him particularly beloved by ordinary people, who saw in him a god who understood their struggles and was willing to advocate for them, even against the other gods. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Ninmah, played an equally important role in the creation and nurturing of humanity. As the mother goddess, she embodied the earth's fertility and the principle of generation. She was the divine midwife who assisted at births, both human and animal. She shaped the first humans from clay and breathed life into them. In some texts, she is described as nursing the newborn human race with her own milk, emphasizing her maternal relationship to humanity. Ninhursag's importance in Mesopotamian religion cannot be overstated. Along with Anu, Enlil, and Enki, she formed part of the most exalted group of deities. Temples throughout Sumer were dedicated to her worship, and kings sought her blessing to ensure the prosperity and fertility of their lands. The Mesopotamians understood that without the earth's generosity, without the cycle of birth and growth that Ninhursag represented, human life could not exist. In one intriguing myth, Ninhursag and Enki collaborate on a series of creation experiments, producing various types of beings, some successful and some flawed. This story explores the idea of creation as a process of trial and error, suggesting that the gods themselves learned and adapted as they worked. The flawed beings they created were not destroyed but assigned roles appropriate to their abilities, reflecting a compassionate understanding that all creation has value, even that which is imperfect. The concept of divine me is central to understanding Mesopotamian cosmology and the relationship between gods and humans. The me were divine decrees or principles that governed all aspects of existence, from the physical laws of nature to the social and religious institutions of civilization. Each god controlled certain me within their domain. Enki, in particular, was known as the guardian of the me, keeping them safe in his temple in Eridu. The me covered everything from kingship and priesthood to warfare and music, from truth and justice to craft skills and sexual practices. They were the fundamental organizing principles of reality, the rules by which the universe operated. Possessing the me meant possessing power and authority. When a god gave certain me to humans, they were sharing their divine power, enabling humans to participate in activities that were essentially divine in nature. One famous myth describes how the goddess Inanna, ambitious and proud, travelled to Eridu and got Enki drunk, then convinced him to give her numerous me to take back to her city of Uruk. Enki agreed in his intoxicated state, but when he sobered up and realised what he had done, he sent servants to retrieve the me from Inanna. She refused to return them, and after a series of confrontations, she successfully brought the me to Uruk, greatly increasing her city's prestige and power. This myth explains why Uruk became such a prominent city and illustrates how the transfer of knowledge and culture was understood in divine terms. The scribes who recorded these myths were themselves performing a sacred function. Writing was not simply a practical tool but a divine gift, one of the me that Enki had bestowed upon humanity. The scribes were trained in temple schools, where they learned not only to read and write but also to understand the religious and cultural traditions they were preserving. They saw themselves as guardians of sacred knowledge, intermediaries between the world of the gods and the world of ordinary mortals. The language they used, Sumerian, was itself considered sacred. Even after Sumerian ceased to be spoken as a living language, replaced by Akkadian and later Babylonian, it continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes, much as Latin was used in medieval Europe. To read the ancient myths in Sumerian was to connect directly with the world of the gods, to access wisdom from the dawn of civilization. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, let your mind wander through the streets of cities long turned to dust. Picture Eridu, the first city according to Mesopotamian tradition, built on a mound rising from the marshes at the edge of the Persian Gulf. Its temple, devoted to Enki, was called the Iabzu, the House of the Cosmic Waters. Here the priests performed rituals at the edge of the sacred pool, the place where fresh water welled up from the depths, connecting the temple to Enki's subterranean realm. Imagine Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, where Enlil's great temple, the Ika, the mountain house, dominated the skyline. Pilgrims from all over Mesopotamia came to Nippur to seek Enlil's favour, to have their disputes settled in the shadow of the god's authority. The city's importance transcended politics. Even when different kings ruled different parts of Sumer, Nippur remained neutral ground, a place where all acknowledged the supreme power of Enlil. Envision Uruk, the great city of Inanna, surrounded by massive walls that, according to legend, stretched for 9 kilometres. Within these walls stood the Eanna temple complex, a vast architectural marvel with multiple courtyards, shrines and workshops. Here, the citizens celebrated the sacred marriage ritual each new year, in which the king symbolically married Inanna, ensuring fertility and prosperity for the coming year. The ceremony involved music, dancing, feasting and mystical rites that brought the community together in worship and celebration. These cities were more than simple settlements. They were cosmic centres, each one a microcosm of the universe itself. The temple at the heart of each city was understood as the axis mundi, the central pillar connecting earth to heaven and the underworld. Through the temple, the divine presence entered the human world, and through the temple, human prayers and offerings reached the gods. The ziggurat, that iconic stepped pyramid structure, embodied this cosmic symbolism. These massive architectural achievements, built of mud, brick, and rising in tiers toward the sky, were artificial mountains, attempts to create a meeting place between heaven and earth. At the summit of each ziggurat stood a shrine where it was believed the god would descend to rest. The ziggurat's shape echoed the primordial mountain that, in some creation myths, was the first solid ground to emerge from the cosmic waters. Climbing the steps of a ziggurat was a spiritual journey, each level representing a stage in the ascent from the mundane world to the divine realm. The priests who made this climb were undertaking a sacred pilgrimage, one that ordinary people could not make. They carried offerings, prayers, and petitions to present to the god on behalf of the entire community. The ziggurat thus served as a spiritual bridge, a physical structure that enabled communication between the mortal and immortal realms. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes, begins with a prologue that illustrates the divine basis of human authority and justice. Hammurabi, the great king of Babylon, describes how the gods Anu and Enlil named him to rule, choosing him to bring justice and prosperity to the land. The famous stele depicting Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash makes this divine mandate explicit. Human law is not arbitrary, but reflects divine will and cosmic order. This understanding of law as divine decree had profound implications for Mesopotamian society. Justice was not simply a human concern, but a cosmic principle, one of the me that organized reality. To violate the law was not just to harm your fellow humans, but to offend the gods and disrupt the cosmic order. Conversely, to uphold justice was to participate in maintaining the universe itself, to align oneself with divine will. The Mesopotamian concept of fate, called Shimtu in Akkadian, was another aspect of this cosmic order. The gods determined each person's fate at birth, establishing the trajectory of their life. This fate could not be entirely escaped, yet it was not absolutely fixed either. Through proper behaviour, through honouring the gods and following the me, a person could hope to experience the better possibilities within their fate. The gods could also modify fate in response to prayers, sacrifices, or extraordinary deeds. This understanding of fate gave Mesopotamian life a certain fatalistic quality, yet it did not lead to passivity. People still worked hard, planned for the future, and tried to improve their circumstances. They simply did so with the understanding that ultimate outcomes were in the hands of the gods. This created a kind of spiritual humility, an acceptance that human power and knowledge were limited, and that wisdom lay in aligning oneself with divine will rather than struggling against it. Divination, the practice of reading signs and omens to understand divine will, was an essential aspect of Mesopotamian religious life. The Anunnaki communicated with humanity not only through myths and rituals, but through the patterns of the natural world. Every unusual occurrence, from the flight of birds to the shape of a sheep's liver, from the patterns of oil on water to the movements of the planets, was potentially meaningful, a message from the gods about future events or divine displeasure. Priests trained extensively in the art of divination, mastering complex systems for interpreting these signs. Libraries of omen texts were compiled, cataloguing thousands of observations and their traditional interpretations. If a black dog enters a palace, the foundation of that palace will become secure. If the liver has 2 gallbladders, the king will have no rival. These ancient texts reveal a worldview in which nothing happened by chance, everything was connected, part of a web of divine meaning. The most prestigious form of divination involved observing the heavens. The Mesopotamians were keen astronomers, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, planets and stars with remarkable precision. They identified the zodiac, mapped the major constellations and predicted eclipses. They understood that the heavens were the realm of the great gods, and that celestial movements reflected divine intentions and cosmic patterns. The 7 classical planets, known to ancient astronomers because they moved against the background of fixed stars, were each associated with one of the major Anunnaki. The sun was Shamash, the god of justice. The moon was Sin, the wise elder god. Mercury was Nabu, god of writing and wisdom. Venus was Inanna or Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Mars was Nergal, god of death and the underworld. Jupiter was Marduk, king of the gods in later Babylonian theology. Saturn was Ninurta, the warrior god. To watch these planets move through the sky was to observe the gods themselves, travelling through their celestial realm. When planets appeared bright or dim, when they moved quickly or slowly, when they came together in conjunction or moved apart, these were signs of divine activity, indications of how the gods were interacting and what they might be planning. The priests studied these movements carefully, looking for patterns that might reveal coming events. This celestial divination had practical applications. It was used to determine auspicious times for important activities, when to plant crops, when to wage war, when to hold royal weddings or coronations. It was also used to predict larger-scale events, floods, famines, the rise and fall of kings and dynasties. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that by understanding the patterns of the heavens, they could align their actions with divine will and avoid catastrophe. The underworld, called Kur in Sumerian and Irkala in Akkadian, was another domain of the Anunnaki. This was the realm of the dead, a dark and dusty place beneath the earth where the spirits of the deceased dwelled. It was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal and her consort Nagal, stern deities who presided over the land of no return. Death was understood as a journey to this underworld, a transition from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead. The dead were believed to continue existing in the underworld, though in a diminished shadow-like state. They no longer experienced joy or sorrow, pleasure or pain. They sat in darkness, eating dust and clay, a melancholy existence that made the Mesopotamians deeply appreciate earthly life. To ensure a bearable existence in the underworld, the dead needed to be properly buried and regularly provided with offerings from the living. Families performed rituals to feed and honour their deceased relatives, pouring libations and leaving food at grave sites. If these obligations were neglected, the dead could become restless, returning as ghosts to trouble the living. Many Mesopotamian incantations and rituals were designed to appease angry ghosts or prevent them from causing harm. The most famous journey to the underworld in Mesopotamian mythology is that of the goddess Inanna, recorded in a remarkable Sumerian poem. Inanna, in her arrogance and curiosity, decided to visit the underworld and assert her authority over her sister Ereshkigal. She descended through 7 gates, and at each gate she was forced to remove one of her divine garments and symbols of power. By the time she reached the throne room of Ereshkigal, she was naked and powerless. Ereshkigal was furious at her sister's presumption and killed Inanna, hanging her corpse on a hook to rot. But Inanna had planned ahead, arranging for rescue if she did not return. Her loyal servant sought help from Enki, who created 2 mourners to sympathize with Ereshkigal's pain, thereby winning her favor. Ereshkigal agreed to release Inanna, but the laws of the underworld demanded a substitute. Inanna returned to the surface world to find her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, untroubled by her absence. Enraged, she designated him as her replacement. Dumuzi fled, but was eventually captured and taken to the underworld. His sister Geshtinana, in an act of great love, volunteered to share his fate. The gods arranged that Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld and Geshtinana the other half, creating an eternal cycle. This myth was understood as an explanation for the agricultural cycle, with Dumuzi representing the vegetation that dies each year and is reborn in the spring. The descent of Inanna illustrates several important aspects of Mesopotamian religious thought. First, it shows that even the gods are subject to cosmic laws that they cannot simply ignore. Second, it emphasizes the importance of proper relationships and reciprocity, both among the gods and between gods and humans. Third, it connects divine mythology to the natural cycles that governed Mesopotamian life, particularly the agricultural calendar. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the greatest literary achievement of ancient Mesopotamia, explores the relationship between gods and humans from a more philosophical perspective. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a demigod whose mother was the goddess Ninsun. This mixed heritage gave him extraordinary strength and wisdom, but also made him profoundly aware of his mortality. The epic tells of Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to humble the arrogant king. Together, they undertake heroic adventures, defeating the monster Humbaba and killing the Bull of Heaven. But when the gods decree that Enkidu must die for these transgressions, Gilgamesh is confronted with the reality of mortality. His dearest friend, his equal, his other self grows sick and dies, descending to the dust and darkness of the underworld. Overcome with grief and terror of his own eventual death, Gilgamesh embarks on a quest to find immortality. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Atrahasis, the one human who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh's journey takes him to the ends of the earth, through dangerous lands where no mortal has gone before. He crosses the waters of death itself, driven by his desperate hope that he can escape the fate that awaits all humans. When he finally meets Utnapishtim, the ancient flood survivor tells him the story of the deluge and explains that his immortality was a unique gift, granted under unique circumstances that will never be repeated. The gods have decreed that humans must die. That is part of what it means to be human. However, Utnapishtim, taking pity on Gilgamesh, reveals the location of a plant that can restore youth, offering at least temporary respite from aging. Gilgamesh retrieves this plant from the bottom of the ocean, but on his journey home, while he bathes in a pool, a serpent steals and consumes the plant, shedding its skin and thereby gaining the renewal that Gilgamesh sought for himself. This explains, in mythological terms, why snakes can shed their skin and appear to be reborn, while humans cannot. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest for immortality. Yet he has gained wisdom. He looks upon the great walls of his city, the massive architectural achievement that will long outlast his physical body, and realizes that immortality lies not in living forever, but in the legacy one leaves behind. Through great deeds, through building, through acts that benefit one's community, and are remembered in story and song, a person can achieve a kind of immortality. This philosophical conclusion reflects a mature understanding of the human condition. The Mesopotamians did not promise their people an afterlife of eternal bliss. They acknowledged that death was real, final and unavoidable. What mattered was how one lived, the quality of one's deeds, and the memory one left behind. This focus on earthly life and earthly legacy is quite different from the afterlife-focused religions that would later emerge, but it has its own profound wisdom. The relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu also deserves attention, as it represents the civilizing power of human connection. Enkidu begins as a wild man, living with animals, drinking at waterholes, and knowing nothing of human society. He's brought into civilization through the intervention of a temple priestess of Inanna, who teaches him the ways of humanity. He learns to eat bread, drink beer, wear clothes, and speak. He becomes human through culture, through the gifts that Enki and the other gods had bestowed upon humanity. When Enkidu meets Gilgamesh, the two initially fight, each testing the other's strength. But this conflict transforms into deep friendship, a bond so strong that Enkidu's death shatters Gilgamesh's world. This friendship humanizes both characters, tempering Gilgamesh's arrogance and giving purpose to Enkidu's life. It shows that human existence is not meant to be solitary but communal, that we find meaning through our relationships with others. The Anunnaki, in creating humans from divine blood and earthly clay, created beings capable of such relationships, capable of love, friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice. These qualities elevated humans above mere servants or slaves. They made humans, in some ways, mirrors of the gods themselves, beings who could form communities, build civilizations, and create meaning in a sometimes harsh and unforgiving world. Throughout Mesopotamian mythology, we see recurring themes that speak to deep human concerns. The tension between order and chaos, represented by stories like Marduk's battle with Tiamat, reflects the constant struggle to maintain civilization against the forces of disorder. The conflict between divine authority and divine compassion, embodied in the relationship between Enlil and Enki, explores the balance between justice and mercy. The theme of divine punishment and human resilience appears in multiple myths. Whether it's the flood, the plague sent to reduce human population, or the hardships built into the human condition after the flood, the Mesopotamians understood life as containing inevitable suffering. Yet they also celebrated human ingenuity, adaptability, and persistence in the face of these challenges. Humanity survives not despite the gods, but because certain gods, particularly Enki, advocate for human welfare. The mother goddess Ninhursag embodies the nurturing aspect of divinity, the recognition that creation requires not just power, but care. Her role in shaping and birthing humanity emphasizes that we are not accidents or mistakes, but intentional creations, brought into being with purpose and tended with divine attention. Even when humanity disappoints or angers the gods, this fundamental connection, this maternal bond, remains. The gifts of civilization that the Anunnaki provided to humanity represent an acknowledgement that humans need more than just physical existence. We need culture, art, knowledge, social organization, and spiritual meaning. These gifts transform mere biological existence into truly human life. They enable us to create beauty, pursue justice, seek truth, and contemplate the divine. Writing itself, one of the most important of these gifts, allowed the Mesopotamians to preserve their wisdom and pass it down through generations. The myths we've explored tonight, inscribed on clay tablets thousands of years ago, have survived to speak to us across the vast gulf of time. They remind us that the fundamental questions humans ask about our origins, our purpose, our relationship to the divine, and our mortality are timeless. The ancient scribes who recorded these stories understood that they were preserving something precious, something that connected their present to the distant past when the gods walked among mortals. They saw themselves as links in a chain stretching back to the very beginning of human civilization, to the time when the Anunnaki first shaped clay and breathed life into it, creating our ancestors. In the quiet moments of the night, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself in that ancient world. Picture the starlit sky over the Mesopotamian plain, the same stars that the ancient priests watched and interpreted. Feel the warmth of the sun god Shamash, the same sun that shone on Sumerian farmers tending their fields. Hear the whisper of wind through the date palms, the wind that was understood as the breath of Enlil, the great lord of air. You are connected to those ancient people through the unbroken chain of human culture and consciousness. The divine spark that the Anunnaki placed in the first humans, according to the myths, has been passed down through countless generations to you. You carry within you that same capacity for reason, for creativity, for wonder that defined humanity in its mythic beginnings. The lessons of these ancient stories remain relevant today. The importance of wisdom over mere power, embodied by Enki. The value of nurturing and care, represented by Ninhursag. The necessity of balance between order and compassion, illustrated in the tension between Enlil and Enki. The understanding that life is finite but meaningful, explored in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These are not just ancient concerns but human concerns, as applicable now as they were 4,000 years ago. The Mesopotamian worldview, for all its differences from modern thought, contains profound insights into the human condition, the recognition that we are both earthly and divine, both material and spiritual, the understanding that civilization requires constant maintenance and effort, that order is always threatened by chaos and must be continually renewed. The acknowledgement that our relationship with the divine, however we understand it, is central to finding meaning and purpose in existence. As you continue to relax, let these ancient stories become like a gentle river, carrying you peacefully towards sleep. There is no need to grasp at the details or remember every name and event. Simply let the flow of these tales wash over you, connecting you to the deep roots of human civilization, to the first cities, the first temples, the first written words. The Anunnaki, whether understood as literal beings or as mythological expressions of cosmic principles, represent humanity's earliest attempts to understand the forces that shaped our world and our existence. They embody the mystery of creation, the power of nature, the complexity of divine will. Through stories about these gods, the ancient Mesopotamians made sense of their world, found comfort in times of trouble, and celebrated existence in times of plenty. The act of creation itself, so central to these myths, is a profound mystery. How does consciousness arise from matter? How does life emerge from lifelessness? These questions puzzled the ancient Mesopotamians just as they puzzle us today. Their answer, that it required the combination of earth and divine essence, of clay and the blood of gods, is a poetic expression of the fundamental mystery of existence. That first moment when the gods mixed clay with divine blood and shaped it into human form, when Ninhursag breathed life into inert matter and consciousness awakened for the first time, that mythic moment represents something real, the emergence of human awareness in the world. Whether we tell this story through ancient myth or modern evolutionary theory, the wonder of it remains the same. The Anunnaki creating humanity to serve them, to work the fields and maintain the canals, might seem like a story of exploitation, but it can also be understood as a story about purpose and meaning. Humans are not random accidents, but beings created with intention, designed to play a role in maintaining the cosmic order. In serving the divine, whether understood literally or metaphorically, humans participate in something greater than themselves. This gives even humble labour dignity and significance. The farmer tending crops, the artisan making tools, the scribe recording transactions, each is participating in the great work of maintaining civilization, continuing the task that the Anunnaki first assigned to humanity. Work is not merely drudgery, but sacred duty, a way of honouring the divine and fulfilling one's purpose. The rebellious younger gods who refuse to work any longer represent something important too, the recognition that labour without rest, service without reward, becomes unbearable even for divine beings. The creation of humanity was thus not just about the gods avoiding work, but about establishing a sustainable system, one where labour is balanced, where different beings fill different roles according to their nature. This might seem to justify inequality or exploitation, but it can also be read as acknowledging that different beings have different capacities, and that a well-functioning society requires organisation and division of labour. The key is balance, ensuring that no group bears unbearable burdens, that all participants in the cosmic order are treated with respect and receive their due. The Great Flood story, which we've touched on, is perhaps the most memorable episode in these myths. It appears not only in Mesopotamian texts but in many cultures around the world, suggesting either a common historical memory of a catastrophic flood or a universal human fear of being overwhelmed by chaotic waters. In the Mesopotamian version, the flood is both punishment and reset, a way of starting over when things have gone too far astray. But what's most interesting is Enki's disobedience, his willingness to save Atrahasis, despite the divine decree. This suggests that blind obedience to authority is not always the highest virtue, that compassion and wisdom sometimes require standing against the consensus, even a divine consensus. Enki risks the anger of the other gods because he believes humanity deserves to continue, that total destruction is not the answer. This makes Enki a particularly appealing deity, a god who thinks for himself, who uses his intelligence to find creative solutions, who puts compassion above rigid adherence to rules. He represents the principle that wisdom is not just knowledge, but the discerning application of knowledge for good ends. He is a divine model for human behaviour, encouraging us to be thoughtful, innovative, and compassionate. The survival of Atrahasis and his family means that all subsequent humanity descends from this one righteous man and his household. We are the children of survivors, descendants of those who were saved when all else was lost. This creates a sense of connection across all of humanity, a recognition that despite our differences, we share a common origin and a common story. After the flood, the gods' agreement to limit human population through natural means rather than catastrophic destruction represents a kind of divine maturity, a recognition that problems cannot always be solved through violence or force. Sometimes, more subtle and sustainable approaches are necessary. The gods learn from their mistakes, just as humans must learn from ours. This idea that even gods can learn and change is quite different from later religious traditions that emphasize divine perfection and unchangeability. The Mesopotamian gods are powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not omniscient, good but not morally perfect. They make mistakes, have regrets, argue among themselves, and sometimes change their minds. This makes them paradoxically more credible as objects of worship, because they reflect the complexity and ambiguity of life itself. The sacred marriage ritual, where the king symbolically married the goddess Inanna, deserves more attention as an example of how myth was enacted in ritual to connect the human and divine realms. This ceremony, performed annually at the New Year, involved elaborate preparations, processions, and sacred rites. The king represented the shepherd god Dumuzi, Inanna's consort, and through their ritual union, the fertility of the land was ensured for the coming year. This ritual enacted in physical form the mythological pattern established by the gods. It brought the creative and life-giving power of the divine marriage into the human world, renewing the land's fertility and the king's authority. Participants in the ritual, both the king and priestess who played the central roles and the community that witnessed and celebrated, were connecting themselves to the cosmic patterns established at creation. Such rituals were not just symbolic, but were believed to have real, tangible effects. By properly performing the sacred marriage, the community ensured that the rains would come, the crops would grow, and the herds would multiply. If the ritual was performed incorrectly or not at all, disaster could follow. This placed immense responsibility on the king and the priesthood to maintain proper relations with the divine through correct ritual performance. The attention to ritual detail in Mesopotamian religion reflects a worldview in which form and function are intimately connected. The gods had established proper ways of doing things, correct formulas and procedures, and deviation from these could upset the cosmic order. This created a conservative tendency in Mesopotamian culture, a respect for tradition and established practice. Yet this conservatism was balanced by innovation and adaptation. As cities rose and fell, as different peoples conquered and were conquered, as dynasties changed and new kings came to power, the myths and rituals evolved to reflect new realities. Gods from different cities and cultures were identified with each other, or incorporated into expanding pantheons. New myths were created to explain current events or legitimize new rulers. The Babylonian elevation of Marduk to the head of the pantheon, for instance, reflected Babylon's political rise to dominance. The Enuma Elish, which makes Marduk the hero who defeats chaos and creates the world, was a religious justification for Babylonian imperial authority. Yet even as Marduk was promoted, the older gods were not abandoned but were incorporated into the new hierarchy, with Marduk taking on attributes and powers previously associated with Enlil or other deities. This religious and mythological flexibility allowed Mesopotamian civilization to adapt and endure through millennia of political change. The core stories of creation, of the relationship between gods and humans, of divine will and cosmic order, remained constant even as specific details were reinterpreted for new contexts. The Anunnaki continued to be the divine family that had created and guided humanity, even as different cities or kingdoms emphasized different members of that family. The scribble schools, called adubas or tablet houses, were crucial institutions for preserving and transmitting this religious and cultural knowledge. Young boys, typically from elite families, were sent to these schools to learn the complex cuneiform writing system, which used hundreds of different signs and could take years to master. They copied out standard texts, learned mathematics and accounting, studied traditional literary and religious works, and were trained in the proper performance of rituals. These scribes formed an educated elite that served kings, temples, and wealthy merchants as administrators, accountants, and religious specialists. They were the guardians of tradition, the keepers of the cultural memory, the ones who ensured that the ancient wisdom was not lost. Their work of copying, recopying, and preserving texts is why we have access today to these remarkable myths and legends. The physical tablets they created, baked clay inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, have proven remarkably durable. Thousands upon thousands of these tablets have survived, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, preserved by the dry climate and the durability of fired clay. When archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century, they uncovered entire libraries of cuneiform texts, opening a window into a civilization that had been almost completely forgotten. The decipherment of cuneiform writing was itself an epic achievement, comparable to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Scholars painstakingly worked out the meanings of the signs, using bilingual inscriptions and careful comparisons to gradually reconstruct the ancient languages of Sumerian and Akkadian. Through their efforts, the voices of the ancient Mesopotamians, silent for 2 millennia, began to speak again. Reading these ancient texts, we hear echoes of real people grappling with real questions. How did the world begin? Why do we exist? Why do we suffer? What happens after death? How should we live? The answers they found, expressed through the myths of the Anunnaki, reflect the worldview and values of their specific culture. Yet the questions themselves are universal, and the mythological mode of answering them through story, rather than abstract philosophy, has its own kind of wisdom. Myths speak to us on multiple levels simultaneously. They can be understood literally, as stories about what actually happened in some primordial time. They can be understood symbolically, as expressions of psychological or spiritual truths. They can be understood functionally as explanations for natural phenomena or social customs. They can be understood aesthetically as beautiful stories that move and inspire us. All these levels of meaning are present and valid. The myth of humanity's creation from clay and divine blood can be understood literally as an account of how the gods made the first people. It can be understood symbolically as expressing the dual nature of human existence, both earthly and spiritual, both finite and touched by infinity. It can be understood functionally as explaining why humans must work and why they owe service to the gods. And it can be appreciated aesthetically as a moving story about the mystery of consciousness and existence. As you lie here in the darkness, letting these ancient stories wash over you, you are participating in something humans have done for thousands of years, gathering together in the evening to share stories, to connect present reality with the mythic past, to find meaning and pattern in existence. The medium may have changed, from oral storytelling around a fire to written text on clay tablets to digital words transmitted through the air, but the essential human need to hear and tell stories remains constant. The Anunnaki, in the final analysis, represent humanity's first sustained attempt to think about thinking, to become conscious of consciousness, to use our divine spark of intelligence to understand its own origins. In creating myths about gods who created humans, the Mesopotamians were exploring the mystery of their own existence, the astonishing fact that the universe had produced beings capable of wondering about the universe. This capacity for wonder, for questioning, for imagining origins and endings, is perhaps what most clearly marks humans as special, as different from other earthly creatures. Whether we attribute this capacity to divine intervention, as the Mesopotamians did, or to evolutionary development, as modern science does, the wonder of it remains. Consciousness contemplating consciousness, existence pondering existence. This is the essence of the human condition. The Mesopotamians faced this mystery with creativity and insight, spinning elaborate stories that gave shape and meaning to the unknown. They populated the sky with gods, the earth with divine presence, and the underworld with the honoured dead. They created a universe thick with meaning, where everything from the movement of planets to the liver of a sheep could carry divine messages, where humans were not isolated accidents but purposeful creations, connected to cosmic patterns and divine will. This way of understanding the world may seem alien to the modern scientific mindset, yet it provided the Mesopotamians with a functional worldview that enabled them to create one of history's greatest civilizations. They invented writing, developed mathematics, established law codes, built magnificent cities, and created literature that still moves us today. The myths of the Anunnaki were not obstacles to civilization but part of its foundation, providing meaning, motivation, and moral framework. As we've journeyed through these ancient stories tonight, travelling back to the dawn of civilization, we've encountered themes and ideas that continue to resonate. The tension between power and wisdom, between justice and mercy, between individual will and cosmic order. The value of work, of creativity, of human connection. The inevitability of suffering and death, and the question of how to find meaning despite these harsh realities. The ancient Mesopotamians found their answers in the myths of the Anunnaki, in stories of gods who created humans to serve them but also cared for them, in tales of divine conflicts and reconciliations, in visions of cosmic order maintained through proper ritual and right living. These answers satisfied them for thousands of years, shaping their civilization and giving meaning to countless individual lives. As you prepare to release consciousness and drift into sleep, let yourself feel connected to those ancient people, those first humans who looked up at the stars and wondered about their origins, who told stories to make sense of existence, who built temples to honour forces greater than themselves. You are their descendant, not just genetically, but culturally and spiritually, heir to their questions, even if not to all their answers. The Anunnaki may not be worshipped today, their temples long fallen into ruins, their rituals no longer performed. But the human impulse they represented, the need to connect with something beyond ourselves, to find meaning in existence, to tell stories that link us to cosmic patterns and divine purposes, this impulse remains as strong as ever. We continue to ask the questions that they asked, continue to seek answers to the mysteries that puzzled them. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll walk the ancient streets of Uruk or Eridu, climb the steps of a ziggurat toward the stars, stand before the throne of Enlil, or dive into the cosmic waters of Enki's Abzu. Perhaps you'll witness the creation of the first humans, see Ninhursag shaping clay, watch divine blood mix with earth to form conscious beings. Perhaps you'll understand, in the way that dreams allow understanding, the mystery of your own existence, the miracle of consciousness arising from matter. Let the ancient stories be a lullaby, carrying you gently toward rest. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to remember or understand fully. Simply float on the river of narrative, trusting it to carry you safely towards sleep. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, created humanity according to the myths, and humanity created these myths to understand itself. It is a beautiful circularity, consciousness creating stories about the creation of consciousness. As your breathing slows and deepens, as your muscles relax and your thoughts become more diffuse, picture the primordial waters of creation, dark and vast and peaceful. Picture yourself floating in those waters, supported by them, becoming one with them. The boundaries between self and universe soften and blur. You are clay and divine blood, earth and heaven, mortal and immortal, finite and infinite. The ancient wisdom whispers that we contain multitudes, that we are both mundane and sacred, that in every human being the earth and the divine meet and mingle. This was the gift of the Anunnaki to humanity, this dual nature that makes us capable of both toil and transcendence, both survival and spirituality, both working the fields and worshipping the stars. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of an ancient story, that your existence was prefigured in myths told thousands of years ago, that the questions you carry are questions humans have always carried, that the wonder you feel is the same wonder felt by the first conscious beings who looked up at the night sky and asked why. The Anunnaki created humans to serve them, but in doing so, they created beings capable of creating in return, capable of building civilizations, composing poetry, asking questions, seeking truth. They created beings who could, in turn, create gods, myths, meanings, and purposes. This creative capacity, this divine spark, is your inheritance from the ancient world. Rest in the knowledge that you are connected to something vast and ancient, that your individual life, however small it may seem, is part of a pattern that stretches back to the dawn of consciousness, that every breath you take, every thought you think, echoes through time to those first moments when humanity awakened to itself and wondered at the mystery of existence. The stars above ancient Mesopotamia shine with the same light they cast upon us today, eternal witnesses to the rise and fall of civilizations, to the dreams and fears of countless generations. Those ancient peoples, looking up at the same celestial display, saw not just points of light but the very bodies of their gods, travelling through the heavens on their divine business, writing messages in their movements for those wise enough to read them. The priests of Babylon would spend entire nights on the tops of ziggurats, recording the positions of planets, noting the phases of the moon, tracking the slow procession of constellations across the sky. They understood that time itself was cyclical, that the movements of the heavens followed patterns that, repeated, that the cosmos was ordered and knowable, if only one studied it carefully enough. This knowledge gave them power and prestige, made them indispensable to kings who needed to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to wage war. The calendar they developed, based on the cycles of the moon, organised time into months and years, creating a framework for agriculture, religion, and commerce. Each month was dedicated to particular deities, with festivals and rituals marking the passage of time and connecting human activity to divine patterns. The new year, falling in the spring during the month of Nisanu, was the most important festival, a time when the world was symbolically renewed, when chaos was once again defeated and order re-established. During the New Year festival in Babylon, the Enuma Elish was recited in its entirety, reminding the people of how Marduk had defeated Tiamat and created the world from her body. The king would participate in elaborate rituals, symbolically surrendering his power and then having it renewed by Marduk. He would take the hands of Marduk's statue, reaffirming his role as the god's earthly representative. The entire city would be involved in processions, sacrifices, and celebrations that lasted for 11 days. This festival was not merely entertainment or tradition, but a vital act of cosmic maintenance. The Mesopotamians believed that the victory over chaos had to be ritually reenacted each year to ensure its continuation. Without proper ritual, without the community coming together to honour the gods and reaffirm the patterns established at creation, the cosmic order might unravel and chaos might return. Every participant in the festival was thus participating in the maintenance of creation itself. This understanding of ritual as cosmologically necessary gave Mesopotamian religion a serious, even anxious quality. So much depended on doing things correctly, on maintaining proper relations with the divine, on ensuring that offerings were made and prayers were said. The gods were not distant or indifferent, but actively involved in the world, capable of bringing blessing or catastrophe depending on how they were treated. Yet the gods were also understood to be in some sense dependent on humans. They needed the offerings that sustained them, the temples that housed them, the rituals that honoured them. When the flood destroyed humanity, the gods nearly starved for lack of offerings. This mutual dependence created a relationship that, while unequal, involved genuine reciprocity. Humans needed the gods for protection and blessing, but the gods also needed humans to maintain the cosmic order through worship and sacrifice. This reciprocal relationship is beautifully expressed in the concept of the temple as the god's house. The great temples of Mesopotamia were not primarily places where humans gathered for worship, as churches or synagogues are today. Rather, they were the actual residences of the gods, palaces, where divine beings dwelt. The inner sanctum of each temple contained a statue of the deity, which was treated not as a mere representation but as a living presence of the god. Each day, priests would ritually awaken the god's statue, bathe it, dress it in fine garments, offer it food and drink, and entertain it with music and incense. The statue would be anointed with precious oils and adorned with jewellery. On festival days, it would be carried in procession through the city streets, allowing the god to see and be seen by the people. These were not empty rituals performed for human benefit, but necessary services provided to divine beings who truly dwelt among mortals. The elaborate care given to divine statues reflects a worldview in which the boundary between the physical and spiritual, between matter and spirit, was more permeable than modern thought typically allows. A statue properly consecrated through ritual could become a vessel for divine presence, a point where the god could manifest in the material world. The statue was simultaneously stone and deity, object and subject, human craftswork and divine presence. This understanding extended to other aspects of Mesopotamian religious life. The ziggurat was simultaneously a pile of mud bricks and a cosmic mountain connecting heaven and earth. The temple was simultaneously a building and the centre of the universe. The king was simultaneously a mortal man and the earthly embodiment of divine authority. Reality had multiple levels of meaning, and religious practice was about navigating between these levels, maintaining proper relationships across the boundary between the human and divine realms. The figure of the divine king is particularly interesting in this context. Mesopotamian kings were not typically considered fully divine in themselves, as Egyptian pharaohs were, but they were seen as chosen and empowered by the gods, as mediators between divine and human realms. The king's primary responsibility was to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order, justice, and truth, ensuring that society functioned according to divine principles. This meant not just military defense and economic management, but also maintaining the cult, ensuring that temples were properly funded and maintained, that rituals were correctly performed, that justice was administered fairly. A good king was one who pleased the gods through piety, and pleased the people through just rule. A bad king was one who neglected either duty, bringing divine wrath upon himself and his land. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated political theology around kingship, expressed in royal inscriptions, hymns, and rituals. The king was described as the shepherd of his people, echoing the shepherd god Dumuzi. He was the strong wall protecting the city, the canal bringing life-giving water, the sun bringing light and justice. These metaphors elevated kingship to cosmic significance, making the king's rule a reflection of divine order. Yet kings were also clearly mortal and fallible. They could be overthrown, could fail in their duties, could die and be replaced. The dynasties of Mesopotamia rose and fell with regularity, each claiming divine sanction, each eventually supplanted by another. This created a certain pragmatism in Mesopotamian political thought. The gods chose kings, yes, but they could also withdraw their favour. Success proved divine blessing, failure suggested divine displeasure. This dynamic relationship between human rulers and divine authority is beautifully illustrated in the Sumerian king list. an ancient text that catalogues the rulers of Sumer from the beginning of time. The list begins with the phrase, "when kingship was lowered from heaven," emphasizing that royal authority is divine in origin. It then lists the kings who ruled before the Great Flood, attributing to them impossibly long reigns of tens of thousands of years, suggesting a golden age when the boundary between gods and humans was less fixed. After the Flood, the king list continues with more historically plausible reigns, though still often exaggerated in length and accomplishment. The list provides a mythologized history of Sumer, connecting each city-state's ruling dynasty to the divine mandate, explaining changes in power as the gods transferring kingship from one city to another. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, each had its time of dominance. Each claimed divine sanction for its rule. The competition between cities was not just political, but theological. Each city's patron deity was believed to be genuinely concerned with that city's welfare and prestige. When cities went to war, their patron gods were understood to be fighting through them. Victory proved that one's god was stronger or more favoured by the divine council. Defeat required theological explanation. Why had the gods allowed it? Usually it was attributed to some failing in worship or moral behaviour that had angered the deity. This created a complex religious landscape, where multiple gods were worshipped simultaneously, with different cities and individuals emphasising different deities. Yet these gods were not understood as independent or contradictory, but as members of a single divine family and council, each with their own domain and responsibilities. The pantheon was organised hierarchically, with Anu at the apex, but it was also understood to function collectively, with important decisions made through divine consensus. The assembly of the gods is a recurring motif in Mesopotamian myths. Before major actions, the gods would gather in council to deliberate and decide. This divine assembly served as a model for human political organisation, with city councils and advisory bodies reflecting the heavenly pattern. Human justice was understood as an attempt to approximate divine justice, human law as an implementation of cosmic law. The famous law codes of Mesopotamia, including Hammurabi's code and earlier Sumerian codes, were presented as divinely inspired. Hammurabi's stele shows him receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, god of justice. The laws themselves cover everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family law and criminal penalties. They attempt to establish a just social order, one that reflects divine principles of fairness and reciprocity. Many of these laws operate on the principle of measured reciprocity, an eye for an eye, as the famous phrase goes. This principle, far from being primitive or vengeful, represents an attempt to limit retaliation, to ensure that punishment is proportionate to offence. It recognises human tendency toward disproportionate revenge and seeks to channel that impulse toward measured justice. The gods, through their earthly representative the king, establish rules that prevent chaos and maintain order. The laws also reveal the stratified nature of Mesopotamian society. Different penalties applied depending on whether the victim was free, freed or enslaved, whether they were male or female, rich or poor. This inequality offends modern sensibilities, but reflected the social reality of ancient Mesopotamia and was understood as part of the divinely ordained order. Each person had their place in society, and that place carried both rights and responsibilities. Women in Mesopotamian society occupied a complex position. They could own property, engage in business, and even serve as priestesses in temples. Yet they were also subject to male authority, first their fathers and then their husbands. The goddess figures in the mythology reflect this complexity. Goddesses like Inanna were powerful, independent and commanding. Ninhursag was revered as the Great Mother. Yet in myths, even powerful goddesses were often subordinate to male gods, particularly to Enlil and later Marduk. The figure of Inanna or Ishtar deserves special attention, as she was one of the most important and interesting deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Goddess of love, sexuality, fertility and war, she embodied contradictions and complexities. She was beautiful and terrible, nurturing and destructive, generous and vindictive. Her myths explore the full range of human passion and power, from tender love to violent rage. Inanna's descent to the underworld, which we touched on earlier, is one of the most profound myths in the Mesopotamian corpus. It can be read on many levels, as a vegetation myth explaining seasonal cycles, as an initiation narrative exploring death and rebirth, as a psychological journey into the shadow self, as a meditation on the limits of power and the universality of mortality. Like all great myths, it resists simple interpretation, offering new insights with each reading. The myth's symbolism is rich and layered. Inanna must remove her divine garments and jewellery at each of the 7 gates, arriving naked and powerless before her sister. This stripping away can be understood as the removal of social status and identity, revealing the bare self beneath all roles and pretensions. In the underworld, all are equal. Death is the great leveller, acknowledging no distinctions of rank or power. Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, is often portrayed as a dark mirror of Inanna. Where Inanna is associated with life, love, and the upper world, Ereshkigal rules death, mourning, and the lower world. Yet they are sisters, 2 aspects of existence that cannot be separated. Life contains death, just as death makes life possible. The goddess of fertility must confront the goddess of mortality, and in doing so, both are transformed. The detail that Ereshkigal is in labour, giving birth while Inanna is being judged, adds another layer of meaning. Birth and death, beginning and ending, are intimately connected. One cannot exist without the other. The mourners that Enki creates to sympathise with Ereshkigal's pain succeed in their mission precisely because they acknowledge suffering rather than trying to fix or ignore it. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer is simple presence and recognition. Dumuzi's fate, being dragged to the underworld as Inanna's substitute, seems cruel, yet it too carries meaning. He had not mourned her absence, had presumed to sit on her throne, had not valued their relationship enough to grieve when she was gone. His punishment is proportionate to his failure. Yet even this is not final, as his sister's love and sacrifice create a cycle of alternation, suggesting that death itself is not absolute but part of a larger pattern. This myth influenced agricultural rituals throughout Mesopotamia. The death of Dumuzi, the shepherd god, was mourned annually, with women performing laments for the dying god. His return from the underworld was celebrated as the return of vegetation in spring. Thus, the cosmic drama of the gods was enacted in the natural world and in human ritual, creating a threefold correspondence between myth, nature, and culture. Such correspondences were central to Mesopotamian religious thought. The cosmos was understood as fundamentally unified, with patterns repeating at different scales. What happened in heaven was reflected on earth. The microcosm mirrored the macrocosm. Human society was organized according to divine patterns. This worldview gave life coherence and meaning, connecting every aspect of existence to cosmic order. The concept of the me that we discussed earlier is crucial to understanding this unified worldview. The me were not abstract principles, but concrete powers and functions that could be transferred, stolen, or redistributed. They were, in essence, the building blocks of civilization, the fundamental patterns and practices that made culture possible. When Inanna stole the me from Enki and brought them to Uruk, she was transferring the very essence of civilization to her city. The list of me in various texts is fascinating, including such diverse things as kingship, priesthood, godship, the throne, the scepter, the staff, the shrine, shepherdship, royalty, lasting and abundant period of queenship, the musical instruments, the art of the hero, power, enmity, straightforwardness, destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, falsehood, art of the rebel lands, art of kindness, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, judgment, decision, the musical instruments, making judgments, deciding lawsuits, the art of the blacksmith, the art of the basket weaver, the art of the leather worker, the art of the fuller, and many more. This list reveals that the Mesopotamians understood both positive and negative aspects of existence as part of the divine order. Even negative things like falsehood, enmity, and fear were me, essential components of reality that had their place in the cosmic scheme. The gods did not create a perfect world, but a complete one, containing potentials for both good and evil, construction and destruction, joy and sorrow. This acceptance of life's full complexity, including its darker aspects, gave Mesopotamian religion a certain philosophical maturity. There was no expectation of a perfect world or a perfect society. The gods themselves were flawed, making mistakes, experiencing conflicts, sometimes acting from jealousy or anger. This realistic assessment of existence, acknowledging suffering and evil as intrinsic to reality, rather than aberrations or illusions, created a worldview that could accommodate life's difficulties without requiring extensive theodicy. The question of why bad things happen, which so troubles monotheistic religions that must reconcile suffering with an all-good, all-powerful God, was simpler for the Mesopotamians. Bad things happened because the cosmos contained both positive and negative forces, because the gods could be angry or capricious, because chaos always threatened to overwhelm order, because humans were mortal and the world was difficult. This was simply the nature of reality, to be accepted and endured rather than explained away. Yet this did not lead to despair or nihilism. Despite acknowledging life's difficulties, Mesopotamian culture celebrated existence with enthusiasm. Their literature includes not just solemn religious texts, but also love poetry, drinking songs, humorous tales, and wisdom literature that revels in life's pleasures. The Epic of Gilgamesh, after exploring the inevitability of death, ultimately celebrates life precisely because it is finite and precious. There is a wonderful passage in Gilgamesh where the barmaid Siduri offers advice to the despairing hero. She tells him, "When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind but retained eternal life in their own keeping. You, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, enjoy yourself day and night, make merry each day, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean, your head be washed, bathe in water, cherish the child who holds your hand, let your wife be happy against your breast, for this is the destiny of mortals. This, advice to enjoy life while it lasts, to find pleasure in simple things, to value human relationships and everyday joys, represents a profound wisdom. It accepts mortality without either denying it or being paralyzed by it. It finds meaning not in escape from the human condition, but in full embrace of it. This life-affirming philosophy coexisted easily with belief in the gods and regular temple worship, suggesting a healthy balance between religious duty and worldly enjoyment. The Mesopotamians were neither ascetics who rejected worldly pleasure, nor hedonists who pursued it without limit. They understood life as requiring balance, moderation, and attention to multiple needs and values. Work and rest, duty and pleasure, solemnity and celebration, all had their place. The cosmic order they revered was not a static perfection, but a dynamic balance, maintained through constant effort and adjustment. This principle of balance is beautifully expressed in the complementary roles of Enlil and Enki. Enlil represented authority, power, order imposed from above. Enki represented wisdom, creativity, order achieved through intelligence and adaptation. Neither alone was sufficient, both were necessary. Too much Enlil-like authority without Enki-like wisdom led to tyranny and rigidity. Too much Enki-like cleverness without Enlil-like authority led to chaos and instability. The tension between these two gods, their conflicts and eventual reconciliations, can be read as a meditation on different approaches to governance and ethics. Is it better to have strict rules firmly enforced, or flexible guidelines adapted to circumstances? Should authority be absolute or limited? Should power be concentrated or distributed? The myths don't provide simple answers, but explore these questions through narrative, showing the consequences of different choices. The Great Flood story is fundamentally about this tension. Enlil wants to solve the problem of human noise and disorder through total elimination. Enki wants to solve it through more subtle means, preserving humanity while addressing legitimate concerns about population and behaviour. Neither approach is entirely right or wrong, and the final solution involves compromise, incorporating elements of both perspectives. This willingness to portray divine disagreement and compromise is remarkable. Many religious traditions present divine will as unified and unquestionable. The Mesopotamian tradition, by contrast, shows the gods debating, disagreeing, persuading each other, sometimes changing their minds. This suggests a more democratic, or at least oligarchic, model of divine governance, one that values consultation and consensus over unilateral decree. This divine model influenced human political practice. City assemblies, councils of elders, and royal advisory bodies were all understood as earthly reflections of the divine assembly. Important decisions should not be made by a single individual, however powerful, but through collective deliberation. Multiple perspectives should be heard before reaching judgment. This created a political culture that, while not democratic in the modern sense, involved more consultation and consensus building than simple autocracy. The role of the assembly in Mesopotamian city-states has been debated by scholars, but it's clear that some form of collective decision-making existed alongside royal authority, at least for important matters. The Epic of Gilgamesh shows him consulting with both an assembly of elders and an assembly of young men before undertaking his expedition against Humbabar. This suggests that even kings needed to secure communal support for major undertakings. The city itself was understood as a community of both gods and humans. The patron deity was not a distant ruler but a resident, dwelling in the temple at the city's heart, participating in the city's life through cult and ritual. Other gods also had shrines and chapels within the city, creating a divine population alongside the human one. In managing city affairs, humans were thus managing a community that included divine members whose interests had to be considered. This created an interesting dynamic in which humans were simultaneously servants of the gods and their caretakers. The gods needed humans to maintain their temples, provide their offerings, and perform their rituals. In this sense, humans had a certain leverage, though they had to exercise it carefully. Neglect the gods, and divine wrath might follow. But properly attend to them, and divine favour could be secured. The offerings made to gods were substantial. Temples received regular deliveries of bread, beer, meat, fish, oil, and other foodstuffs. Fine garments were provided for divine statues. Precious metals and jewels adorned the shrines. Musicians and singers performed for the gods. Incense burned continually. The economic burden of maintaining the cult was considerable, but it was understood as necessary investment in cosmic maintenance and communal prosperity. Temple economics was sophisticated and well documented. Temples owned extensive agricultural lands, employed large numbers of workers, engaged in trade and money lending, and served as economic redistributors, collecting surplus and supporting those who could not support themselves. The temple was not just a religious institution, but an economic one, arguably the most important economic institution in the city. The priesthood that managed these temple complexes formed a distinct social class. Priests were educated, literate, and economically secure. They served as ritual specialists, performing the daily offerings and major festivals that maintained divine favour. They also served as scribes, administrators, and advisors. Entry into the priesthood was typically hereditary, with priestly families maintaining their positions across generations, though temple offices could also be purchased or received as royal gifts. Different priestly offices had different functions and status. High priests and priestesses, often of royal blood, presided over major temples and wielded significant political influence. Ritual specialists performed specific ceremonies, such as exorcisms, purifications, or divination. Musicians and singers provided the entertainment the gods required. Temple administrators managed property and personnel. Each role was understood as service to the gods, participation in maintaining cosmic order. Female religious officials held important positions in Mesopotamian religion. High priestesses could wield considerable authority, particularly in the cult of Inanna. The Entu priestess in some cities was typically a king's daughter, devoted to the service of the city's patron god, living in the temple complex and presiding over certain rituals. Other female religious roles included musicians, singers, and various types of consecrated women who served the gods in different capacities. The association between temples and sacred sexuality is attested in Mesopotamian sources, though its exact nature remains debated. Inanna was associated with sexuality as well as warfare, and her cult seems to have included sexual rites of some kind. Some women associated with her temples were designated with terms that might indicate sacred prostitution, though this interpretation is controversial. What's clear is that sexuality was not seen as sinful or shameful, but as a divine gift, part of the life force that the gods had granted to creation. The sacred marriage ritual we mentioned earlier involved symbolic sexual union between the king and a priestess representing Inanna. This ritual enacted the divine pattern of Inanna and Dumuzi, bringing the fertility and creative power of that divine marriage into the human realm. Sexual imagery in Sumerian love poetry associated with this ritual is frank and joyful, celebrating physical pleasure as holy and life-affirming. This positive attitude towards sexuality reflects the Mesopotamian creation myth, in which humans are created partly to reproduce and multiply. Sexuality serves divine purposes, ensuring the continuation of the human workforce that maintains cosmic order. Fertility, both human and agricultural, was actively sought through ritual and prayer. Barrenness was considered a terrible affliction, a sign of divine disfavour. Children were greatly desired and carefully raised. They represented the future, the continuation of family lines, and security in old age. Education, for those who could afford it, began young, with boys entering scribal schools around age 7. There they learned reading, writing, mathematics, and the traditions of their culture. Girls typically received education at home, learning the skills necessary for managing a household, though some elite women could become literate and even served as scribes. Family relationships were governed by both love and duty, shaped by religious understanding of proper roles and relationships. Honour your father and mother, obey your elders, care for your children, maintain family tombs and offerings to ancestral spirits. All these were both moral obligations and religious duties. The family was the basic unit of society, and maintaining family harmony contributed to maintaining cosmic order. The concept of ancestral spirits connects to the Mesopotamian understanding of death and the afterlife. The dead descended to the underworld but remained connected to the living through memory and ritual. Regular offerings to the dead kept them content in their shadowy existence. Neglected dead became restless ghosts, able to trouble the living with illness or misfortune. Proper burial and ongoing remembrance were thus crucial obligations that the living owed to the dead. The underworld, as we've discussed, was not a place of punishment or reward, but simply where all the dead went, regardless of how they had lived. There was no concept of heaven or hell, no expectation that virtue would be rewarded or vice punished after death. Justice, if it existed, operated in this world, not the next. This placed even greater emphasis on earthly life as the arena where meaning was made and goodness pursued. Some texts suggest belief in protective spirits or guardian angels, supernatural beings assigned to individuals to watch over them. These personal gods were distinct from the great gods of the pantheon, but served as intermediaries, advocating for their assigned humans before the divine council. Maintaining a good relationship with one's personal god was important for prosperity and protection. Prayer and hymns addressed to the gods form a significant portion of surviving Mesopotamian literature. These texts reveal how ordinary people understood and related to the divine. Some prayers are formal and ritual, intended for use in temple ceremonies. Others are personal and emotional, expressing individual fears, hopes, and gratitude. Reading these prayers, we hear voices from 4,000 years ago that sound remarkably human, worried about health, seeking protection from enemies, asking for prosperity, expressing devotion. One category of prayer particularly worth mentioning is the sufferer's prayer, in which an afflicted person cries out to the gods, protesting their innocence and asking why they are being punished. These texts acknowledge that sometimes bad things happen to good people, that suffering is not always clearly deserved. They question divine justice while still affirming faith, creating a tension similar to the biblical Book of Job, which was written much later but may have been influenced by these Mesopotamian precursors. The poem Ludlul Bel Nemeki, often called the Babylonian Job, tells of a righteous man who loses everything and suffers terribly, despite having faithfully served the gods. He questions divine justice, noting that what pleases one god might offend another, that humans cannot really understand divine will. Eventually Marduk takes pity on him and restores his fortune. But the text offers no simple resolution to the problem of undeserved suffering. This willingness to question, and even challenge the gods, while still remaining within a framework of faith, is psychologically sophisticated. It acknowledges the full complexity of religious experience, including doubt, anger, and confusion alongside devotion and trust. The gods could be mysterious, even arbitrary, yet they remained worthy of worship and the source of all blessings. This paradox was held without attempting to resolve it into systematic theology. Systematic theology, in fact, was not a major concern of Mesopotamian religion. There was no single orthodoxy, no canonical scripture, no central religious authority defining correct belief. Different cities had different traditions, different versions of myths, different ritual practices. These coexisted without apparent conflict, suggesting a religious tolerance, or at least pluralism, that allowed for diversity of belief and practice. What mattered was not correct belief, but correct practice, performing the rituals that maintained cosmic order and communal prosperity. As long as the temples were maintained, the offerings made, and the festivals celebrated, the gods would be satisfied. Private belief was less important than public performance, which created a religion more concerned with orthopraxy, right action, than orthodoxy, right belief. This emphasis on ritual practice over doctrinal belief may seem strange to those familiar with Christianity or Islam, where correct belief is central to religious identity. But it was common in ancient religions and arguably more typical of how humans have related to the sacred throughout most of history. The ancient Mesopotamians participated in their religion through action, through performance, through embodied ritual, not primarily through intellectual assent to propositions. This does not mean their religion was unreflective or unsophisticated. The myths we've explored tonight show deep philosophical and psychological insight, but this wisdom was conveyed through story and enacted through ritual rather than systematized into theological doctrine. Truth was narrative and performative rather than propositional. The educational system reinforced this approach. Scribal students copied out myths, hymns, and ritual texts, absorbing their culture's wisdom through repeated engagement with traditional texts. They learned not abstract theology, but the stories of the gods, the proper forms of worship, the traditional wisdom handed down through generations. Knowledge was embedded in texts that were memorized, recited, and enacted. Wisdom literature, another genre of Mesopotamian text, offered practical and ethical guidance for daily life. These proverbs and instructions emphasized virtues like honesty, hard work, proper speech, and respect for authority. They warned against vices like laziness, drunkenness, dishonesty, and disobedience. They presented a picture of the good life as lived in proper relationship with others, with the gods, and with cosmic order. Some proverbs: do not lie, speak the truth. Do not steal, but make your days long. Do not kill, the wicked man the god Shamash will pursue. Do not speak insolently to a man older than you. He who eats too much cannot sleep. These straightforward moral instructions show concern for maintaining social order and personal well-being through ethical behaviour. Other proverbs reflect on life's deeper patterns. Where my eyes look, there is sadness. The strong man awaits the hand of fate. In a city where there is no dog, the fox is overseer. These acknowledge life's difficulties while offering insight into social dynamics and human nature. They express a kind of practical wisdom born from experience, passed down to help each generation navigate life's challenges.